right, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Sense and Signal podcast with Jodah and Dan. And we are here with Dr. Julie Murray-Jensen, a friend of mine and a member of my doctoral cohort at Oregon State University. And we're here to talk with Julie today about transitioning from the field of higher education to the nonprofit sector and what that transition looks like. So, Julie, what were some of the primary skills that you think you needed to have to transfer from higher ed to the nonprofit sector? And we'll get into your story about how that happened later on, but I want to front load the skills question first.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the good news is, first of all, it's just a pleasure to be with you guys, Jodah and Dan. Dan, I have so many fond memories of you from our doctoral days and the pain and agony that we experienced together. But I'm happy to say that there's tons of transferable skills between higher ed and the nonprofit sector. I think especially the roles that I was in, a lot of times I was at smaller institutions. And so there was a little bit more of the ability to be a little bit entrepreneurial, which is sometimes unusual in higher ed, but I've just been really blessed to be at those sorts of institutions. And I would say in the nonprofit world, because of usually the smaller size matters, you can be very entrepreneurial, but you have to be able to wear lots of different hats. And I think in higher ed, that certainly is a benefit as well, having lots of different skills that you can apply to do the job. Now, specifically in higher ed, the things I did related to fundraising and partnerships and enrollment growth, those were specifically very useful in the nonprofit sector, that knowledge, but also those skill sets of being able to craft a strategy and follow through and deliver results. So lots of possibilities, though, in terms of transferring.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does make a lot of sense. It sounds like you have a question, Jodah.
Yeah. So this show is going to be a lot about transitions, about moving from point A to point B. And then there's the phase shift of the transition and the process. We're going to kind of deep dive in that, I think, as well. And we could spend forever probably talking about what it means to transition. But transitions start with a beginning, point A. And can you maybe just give us a brief history and describe who you are, just so as we start to just talk this through, we kind of lens it through who Julie Murray, Dr. Julie Murray.
Julie Murray-Jensen.
Murray-Jensen, who has the same last name as me. So we're obviously related at some point.
Yes, exactly. The Jensen part. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I am an achiever with a capital A. And that has been such a strength for me in my career, but it's also been a challenge, to be honest. And my background is in higher ed. I'm from Nebraska, where I went to college and grew up. But then I moved around the Midwest and the West Coast in a variety of professional positions within higher ed. And really about 30 years, when I really look at, everything from being an RA as an undergrad up to a college president, it was about 30 years of experience. And a lot of it was driven by achievement, but also I think human potential. The student success part, I was a longtime dean of students. That was a real driver. So I'm one of those people that I have a lot of compassion, but I also have this desire to sort of move things forward and build things and get things done. And those are two pieces of me that certainly have come to life also in the nonprofit sector. But that lens of drive and really wanting to make a positive contribution that's concrete are things that have followed me throughout my career.
I just want to touch on the achiever piece. When Julie and I were in our doctoral program together, Julie was, always the first person done. Like, she got her stuff done.
I know, I was the obnoxious one.
No, you're the first one to finish your dissertation. I was trailing a little bit behind you, but you're the first person to complete that. And I was always impressed by that. And I definitely echo the compassion and empathy piece that Julie always brought to the conversations as well.
And tell the audience, what were you guys working for? What was the I don't think the audience knows, Dan, the doctorate that you guys were working for.
We both got doctorates in higher education leadership. They're really EDDs. They're not PhDs. We still had to do research, but they're degrees geared toward being a college administrator, being a college leader.
Okay, excellent. And I'm sorry, just to follow up on what you just said. So, great response. And then as far as boots on the ground, what were you doing in education for that first part of your life there?
Yeah. So a variety of roles. I mean, everything from an assistant director. I was on the staff side, so I was never a full-time faculty member, although I did teach at different times. But a lot of the student leadership piece, and really getting into residence life and Greek affairs and student activities, and then moving my way up into various administrative positions where ultimately I became a dean of students. Then I was a longtime vice president of student affairs, and then got shifted over to external affairs. It was interesting. I was on a semester at sea voyage where I was a staff member. And when I came back from that voyage, my college president said, I think I'm going to totally change your vice presidential role. And then I became this vice president of external affairs, which included enrollments, fundraising, workforce. It was this really interesting position all about kind of bringing in resources to the institution. And I did that for, years. And then I was a college president for about a year, had a super painful exit from that position, but it gave me a chance to sort of regroup and figure out what I wanted to do next. And that ultimately has transpired into becoming a nonprofit executive director, which I never imagined, Jodah, I'm telling you, and Dan probably knows this, I never thought I would find a field that was as meaningful to me as higher ed. But I've got to say, nonprofit work really has been. It's like surprises myself to say that. Because for a while, I almost felt a sense of almost vulnerability, shame. Gosh, is this really the direction I want to go? But yet it's just been fantastic, and I've really grown to appreciate it.
Well, I have two things I want to share. One is a contextual thing for the audience. So in higher education, there's several pathways up the administrative ladder. One is the faculty route or the instructional route, where you come up through the faculty ranks and become a dean of instruction and then maybe a vice president of instruction. Then there's the student affairs or student services route, which Julie took, where you go up through student support, student leadership, maybe enrollment services, advising, counseling, things like that. And that will take you on an administrative pathway. There's also the administrative services route, which is more the finance and facilities and those kind of jobs that will lead you up through. And different people will take those different pathways to a college presidency, So I think when I did my dissertation, I looked at that with the sample of folks I interviewed, and about 1/3 came from each of those pathways to the presidency. So there's different ways to get there. And I will say, to underscore what Julie's sharing about her commitment to higher education, you do not go into an EDD program thinking that you're going to leave higher ed. That is, you're doing that because you're doubling down on, this is my career. I'm going to become a president at some point, and that's how I'm going to finish my career. So Julie, after we all started to graduate and finish up our dissertations, got her dream job, she thought, as a president, and moved across the country to take that job. And I don't know how much you want to share about that. We don't need to go into it, but I will say being a college president is very hard. Tenures tend to be short. being a college administrator from anywhere from the dean on up is very difficult. Very difficult. And we do have a lot of turnover in higher education. And maybe that's where I want to enter this with you, Julie, before we turn to your transitioning phase out of higher ed, is just the climate of higher education right now. Because we met with our cohort recently, about 8 or 9 people who have went through the program. And at least I'd say almost half of them are no longer in higher education. And they all had painful exits. Yeah. So
really?
What do you think? Oh yeah.
And where did they go? Just different places, or did they go to the tech, or what was?
I think one is currently unemployed. One is
state
working at the state level, so still kind of in higher ed, but not on a college campus in the state level.
Not what they were expecting. Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely not what they were expecting.
Nonprofits. One went to K-12 administration.
Yep.
So that really struck me too, Dan, that literally half of us, and this was a very talented group of people, have elected, some by choice, some not by choice, to leave the field. So, it's interesting.
And one I think we should also add, the one person, not the one person, because there were several people of color in our cohort, the one Black male member of our cohort is looking to make an exit too.
He is, yeah, and he's so talented. I know it makes me sad for the field. So it's an interesting thing because I had so many good years in higher ed. I mean, I loved the field, like I said, that human potential part of helping people improve their lives and connect with their talents to make the world a better place. I was deeply meaningful to me, and I had a great run with decades of just really fantastic experienced colleagues. But I do think that it is just such a difficult time, and has been for some time now, in higher ed, in terms of just the data, the demographics, the just decline of high school graduates, the enrollment declines, and that reduction of resources after so many decades of growth is just really painful, because we've built this system that is in some ways too large for the market that we are in. And it's really hard to reduce. It's really hard to do that in a strategic but yet compassionate way. And I think it's hard on faculty and staff. It's hard on students. It's hard on leaders. I remember from our doctoral program, this is just one small example, we were talking about budget cuts, which really, that is the world that I anticipate higher ed will be in for years to come because of the demographics. And I remember the advice was, gosh, don't just make blanket cuts at an institution. Lots of leaders do that because it's sort of this simple thing. Everybody gets a 5% reduction in their department, but it's much better to look at where are the areas within the college making more revenue and really setting them up to even do more, and then strategically cutting. But I will tell you, from an equity lens and from a human lens, being in a leadership position where you're making those decisions, it is so incredibly difficult because there is so much fear. And I think that for years to come, and now, it's created this sense of that fear of a little toxicity, a little fear-based decision-making, fear of loss, that's made it very difficult for everybody involved. And it just makes me super sad.
Actually, the fear of loss and fear in general just always brings out the best in people, right?
Oh my gosh.
It's a good environment to swim in.
Absolutely.
So that defines the higher education environment now: fear of loss and fear in general.
Yeah, to the point, I work at a college where the president's leaving, and one of the rumors that immediately started to circulate was, we're shutting down the college. And it's like, no, the person just got another job, but that's the kind of environment, people are definitely afraid, is our institution going to get shut down at some point? And that creates a lot of anxiety for people.
And so Dan and I have spoke a lot about higher education for all sorts of reasons. We got 5 startups that we have in our back pocket and all sorts of things. But you hit on, and I think Dan's hit on too, this issue about declining or a smaller market. What does that mean exactly? Why is a smaller market? Is it because it's targeting the relevant curriculum that the world needs, and so it's just missing the mark, or is it because the population's smaller? Is it because what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, gosh, like any kind of complex question, there's a varied, complex answer to that. I mean, some of it is literally just population decline in terms of that high school group. Some of it is innovation with micro-credentials and other forms of education and training that have gained some credibility and are options. Some of it is really looking with an equity lens about, gosh, what credentials do jobs really need for people to be successful? Does it always have to be a 4-year degree? So I think a combination of very positive evolutions, but also just some numbers that are tough and budgetary numbers in terms of what it costs to run a college. Now that we have IT and so many online classes, that's a whole new division that maybe you didn't have as fully as you do now with instructional design 30 years ago. It's a tough thing to fund.
So it's also overhead is going up too.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and I would also argue other factors, increasing competition. There was a period of time where higher ed was really heavily doubling down on international students and really growing those programs.
I remember
that. There was concern at the time, like, are we investing too much in international programs because you're one global crisis away from it all imploding? And that we had two. We had Donald Trump and we had COVID. Between the both of those, that caved in international programs.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, as they were imploding in the United States, you had a rise of other colleges around the world stepping up to the plate to take those students. And so we missed an opportunity there to keep those international students that we had because of how we were managing those programs, I think. And we weren't paying attention to we were paying attention to what was happening politically in the country, but I don't think people were thinking about these policies around visas are going to have a negative impact on international enrollment, and that's going to have a trickle-down effect on college budgets and actually have a negative effect on domestic students as well, because those international programs were bringing in big dollars that would also help domestic students too by paying for services. So
that's I remember. Are there lessons to be learned? Again, this is a conversation Dan and I have had many times, and this to both of you. Are there lessons to be learned from the corporate world? When you talk about downsizing, and by no means does the corporate world own downsizing. It does it gracefully. There's no ownership there. No one does that well. We love to build. We build great. Yeah. But when it comes to managing, we do that a little less well. And when it comes to deconstructing, we suck. And everybody does for the most part. Not in our genes, I guess. But one thing that like an organization can do sometimes, like they have these different divisions. And when the division becomes untenable or it's not working for them, they'll sell it. They downsize. They gracefully like, we don't need this part anymore. This is actually, let's unload this and get some money for that. So there are tools in their tool belt to kind of slightly manage size and change of direction. I've been in many of those acquisitions. In fact, I've been in one recently, where I was part of a company and we got sold from one company to another company. So the other company got smaller and the other company got bigger. So anyways, not saying that's the answer, but are there answers? Are there things to be had from the corporate world to help with higher ed today?
I think there are lots of lessons that, corporations can teach higher ed and nonprofits, and then nonprofits and higher ed can teach corporations. I mean, I think there probably needs to be a little bit more back and forth between those entities in terms of training and in terms of learning so that we can pull out best practices. I will say, though, to you that one of the reasons that I transitioned to nonprofits and not corporate for-profit business, is because that human compassion side was so strong in me. And I think that is true for a lot of folks in higher ed. And there are certainly purpose-driven businesses. The nonprofit I run now serves purpose-driven businesses. So there are organizations that have cultures that it's not just for profit. There are other important goals that they're trying to achieve in addition to profit, because you need profit to be sustainable. And so, finding organizations that are focused on culture that really values human beings, I think is the centering piece that that we need to keep our eyes on in whatever sector that we're in.
Yeah, and I think that's a good opportunity to transition to talking about transitions, right? So we've kind of established higher ed's in turmoil. It's shrinking. It's very painful. That led to your painful exit from higher education and into a transitional space. Can you talk a little bit about what that felt like? You know, you built up this career over 30 years, achieved the presidency, had to exit it, and where did you find yourself?
Yeah, it's so nice to be able to talk about it now in a place where I am feeling good and strong, because certainly any kind of life transition that's major, whether it's professional or personal, does throw you for a loop. And there were a couple of years there that even though I had started my own consulting business and I was having some success there, you still feel so much loss when you make a major shift in your professional identity. And for me, really letting go of seeing myself as a higher education administrator, executive, was an important part of that process. And it feels pretty empty for a couple of years. And it feels like you're kind of throwing things at the wall and trying things, and some things are sticking and some things aren't. There's a lot of kind of mourning. I think of the stages of grief that lots of us have read about with denial.
I have read about that.
Eventually you get to acceptance. And so it's not a fun time. There are moments of victory where you feel like you've really learned something deeper about yourself, that you've taken that time to spend alone, to reflect, and to really think about what's most important to you. And so there certainly are benefits of uncovering what's next in that neutral zone. And the language I'm using, Dan, is really from a book that I love that I discovered during this period called Transitions by William Bridges. But it's not an easy road, and it takes much longer, I think, for most of us than one would think it would. And that's a painful part too, just the length of time.
Yeah, I have a colleague of mine who has transitioned out of higher ed, and when she was doing that, she I remember reading articles about the grieving process, especially because when you're coming up through the ranks of higher ed and you're getting tenure or you're achieving this or that definitely becomes a part of your identity. It's who you
Absolutely.
are. And when you leave, those things that gave your life meaning are no longer there. And so you have to learn how to replace that. So how did you do that? How did you start to rebuild Julie Murray-Jensen into a new identity?
Yeah, it's a great question. It took a long time and trying a lot of different things. I mean, I would say that probably through those couple of years in transitioning to nonprofits, the couple of things that I did religiously, of course, are self-care. I did lots of exercise and walking and spending time outside, and lots of time with people that I loved and that I respected and that cared about me. I think knowing that it does take time was a gift to me, because I'm an achiever. So there's a level of impatience that's associated, I think, with being an activator, an achiever, a maximizer, all those strengths that I have. It's hard to be patient. And so just knowing that there is this arc of transitions and leaning into the normality of that and that it's going to feel uncomfortable for a while, and that's a really important part, I think was critical for me. And then just looking for signals and cues. And that comes from the book I mentioned, the Transitions book by Bridges, that, through this, what feels like sometimes a very empty time, really leaning into what's personally meaningful to you, what's your purpose, what do you really love? And I did a lot of experimenting and thinking and really reformulating, okay, what do I want to be next? And that starts with letting go, but then it's its own process of really discovery. And it just takes a long time and a lot of patience, effort, and care for self.
This story reminds me of a thing that happened to me in college before I met Dan, when I was going for a music degree.
When his life was boring. His life only got exciting after he met me.
True. Or worse, depending on how you want to qualify the word. But yeah, it was definitely exciting. Yeah. I was prepping for a piano recital, and I put a lot of energy into it and everything into it. All my eggs in that basket, for about probably about 2-3 months. And I was pushing my limits. It was probably a piece that was beyond my technical ability, technically speaking. But that's just how I do. I like to kind of push the limits of the feet, or historically speaking. Although this kind of taught me something different. And so I went in and performed it, and I thought I nailed it. I'm so happy with the performance. I mean, I was, I was in the moment. I wasn't contemplating the next note. The fifth note. I was just focusing on the next note, and got done. And it was a graded performance. It was for a class, more, but there was people were there watching it. And I got a C. And that just devastated me, because here I am. It's like, I got this disconnect, this complete disconnect of the reality that I perceived that others then perceived. And that haunted me. And today still sort of haunts me, which is what's kind of put me on this trajectory with this show. But that's even happened professionally, to your point, where Dan is saying, where you put all your eggs, where you define yourself by the experience. And it doesn't just because you think it's one way doesn't mean the world thinks it's one way. And we have to reconcile with that's just sort of a reality, And one of the things I appreciate, and Dan knows this, about my experience in Silicon Valley, is it kind of hardened me to that a little bit. And maybe in the wrong way, I don't know. But because of the volatility that Silicon Valley has, where you could be in a job for 6 months, 2 months, a year, and then you're out for all sorts of reasons, simply because the CEO doesn't like you, or because they ran out of money. And you're constantly being challenged on that level. And so you're constantly flexing that muscle and figuring out how to deal with that. And I've discovered that I can handle that transition because of the repetitive nature of that, where I feel if people stick in one position for a very long time, then all of a sudden, if it gets cut off, it's a much heavier damage to the system. So I'm wondering if there's
I do think, to pick up on what you're saying, Jodah, I think the culture of higher education and tech are different in that way, right? Like, the culture of higher ed seems, for the most part, to be people join with an institution and they're there for quite a long time. You have tenure, right? There's somebody at our school,
no such thing in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
No. That's what I'm saying. Like, we have a faculty member at our school who's been teaching there for 50 years.
Isn't that amazing?
Right? Yeah. So you have that kind of longevity built in. And I know administrators who've stayed for a long time. And there's also like this continuity, even if you move to a different institution, that's not going to be. We talk about cultural differences, and they're there, but there's still some continuity in your career. Whereas I think with the tech sector, to your point, it's volatile, and you're always on that roller coaster of losing jobs and having to redefine yourself.
Well, and maybe in that way, it doesn't feel as personal, right?
No, it doesn't. In higher ed,
it can feel very personal, to your point.
And liberating, I'll say on one, because all of a sudden you realize that you see other people who redefine themselves constantly and win. and redefine themselves in ways that you were to think, wow, they redefine themselves like up. Like how'd they do that? And so it becomes very empowering where you see all of that cycle. And so the loss doesn't feel like, it feels more like we're probably going to really get into. It feels more opportunity sometimes than loss. Don't get me wrong. It's not great, but I'm just saying, it's that cycle allows for you to develop a muscle because you're constantly going through it. It probably also makes me go gray. I'm only 23, so but it does. There's something about the future of the world. If we're going to be going into this hustle world we were talking about, this maybe we have to kind of figure out how to muscle up or sense up or something in that area. I don't know. And real quick, Dan, to your point, like if there's a person at my company that's been with the company since like 1990 or 1995. Yeah, those are like unicorns. Your mouth drops when you hear someone's like, I've been at the company for 15 years. You're like, what?
Wow.
It's just,
interesting.
The tech sector is totally different. But let's start talking about your transition or your new beginning. Right, because you go through this liminal space, this neutral space. I know that's the language they use in the book, the transitions book. You go through this neutral or liminal space where you're redefining yourself, rediscovering yourself, do some consulting work, but then you find something. You find a nonprofit pathway. Can you talk a little bit about how you found that and why it excited you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, of course, a lot of these things, I think with transitions, you're looking for signals, but at the same time, it always happens in a way you don't expect, which is the beauty of it. So I was doing a lot of consulting. There was a lot of ARPA money, American Rescue money out there. So I was able to get lots of different gigs and really enjoying that. But I missed the commitment of being with an organization longer term. It was difficult for me to just do 3 months or 6 months. I always felt sort of a loss at the end of the project. And a lot of times you're being paid at a rate that they're not necessarily going to renew you. Right. And so that was just painful for me. I realized, gosh, I'm kind of the person that wears the T-shirt and really lives the organization that I work for. Yeah, so I missed that commitment. And so I saw an executive director position at a nonprofit, and I knew kind of on a cursory level, the board chair, who is a fantastic guy. He's the CEO in our community, wonderful, purpose-driven individual. And I knew him enough because I had done a lot of networking, to approach him. And I said, gosh, would you let me run your nonprofit part-time and pay me a little bit of a higher rate of pay because of my experience. And then I can keep my business going on the side part-time with consulting. And he, after some discussions with the board, found a pathway for me to do that. And that was just a game changer because I started there, did not expect to stay, but wanted to stay for a while to kind of ease the tension of, with consulting, it's hot or cold. And so it was nice to have some consistency. And I really thought, gosh, I'll do this for a couple of years and then I'll figure out a full-time role at another organization, right? I was still in that neutral zone of really trying to figure it out. And over time, what happened is, because I'm a builder, I started to build this nonprofit. I started to add staff and I started to add initiatives and programs related to our mission. And then we updated our mission and now we're expanding our board. And as I started to grow it, because it's only a nonprofit that's only been around since 2014. So it's a little bit of a startup still, which is appealing to me because I have a little entrepreneurial streak. As I built it,
come to Silicon Valley. Come on, get over here.
Yes. As I built it more related to what I thought was beneficial for the community and really fed what I could provide, then it became too big for part-time. And so then we found a pathway for me to go full-time. And I still consult some on the side, but mainly am focused on this. So just a couple different, lessons from that. First of all, utilizing your network, because I did know this person. And also thinking out of the box. I talk to people all the time about creative staffing. What could you do as kind of a placeholds to get you to where you want to go and this new person that you imagine yourself to be. And that was really that part, half and half. Even though it was challenging too, it was still financially sustainable. It gave me a taste of nonprofit work and a chance to build something. And I didn't have to let go of my business, which I was pretty invested in at that time. So
Julie,
it was just
can I ask you a question about this?
Yeah, please.
So there's a show I watch or listened to called How This Was Made, I think, on NPR. It's a great show. Okay. I recommend you watch it. It's a show about how things are made. And they'll take they talk to a person who, I think they did Kate Spade one, and they talk to a person who made Spanx and how she got that. And it's a great story. If you want to hear a rags to riches and
good to know, right?
The grit that she had to do to survive. Your story is fantastic, but as I'm listening to it, I'm not hearing the trials and tribulations, and I know there were. I'm hearing, and so as a casual listener, it just sounds like things kind of just happened. But I know things just didn't just happen. You had to make some things happen. You had to move something. But internally, externally. Right. You didn't, because there are the stories. One of the worst stories on that show is this show, and I'll put a link up. I thought is this one, and God bless him for being successful. It was this popcorn story, but the story was just happenstance. Then my mom had $1 million and she gave us that money. Oh, and then we happened to meet Oprah, and this wasn't a story. This was a lucky thing. That was terrible. And so again, if they had hardship. Okay, well, tell us it. But I know that you had this thing. So what were the big hardships when in that transition that you had to work through? And what were the pieces that got you through that?
Yeah, that is a great question. You go, Jodah. Love it. So I would say
I asked the mean questions. Sorry,
you guys are both so good. I love it.
I'm the good angel. He's the devil.
Yeah, I asked the mean questions.
Well, you know what? And I hate to admit this because it just sounds so shallow, but some of it was ego. I think after
it's not shallow.
After you have a big title of whatever sorts, it is so hard to shift in a way that you feel like the world perceives as less than. And I think there was such an expectation that I had for years being a college leader, a college president, and then going to an executive director, even though, it too is a wonderful role that lots of people do so well. Going from an institution that you oversee that has over 100 employees and now being on a team of 5 at a smaller nonprofit that's really a startup, ego-wise was tough for me. And I hate to say that because skill-wise and the actual work and the relationships in some ways is as meaningful or even more meaningful because I'm so invested because it is a small team and we are on the go and we are building. But I think the perception of the world is something it took me a while to accept. And the part-time route maybe helped me do that because I was able to say, well, I still have my little business on the side, right? I still have my consulting. And then over time, though, I came to value the nonprofit work so much that I didn't feel shame doing it. I didn't feel like it was less than. I feel like, no, this is more than. This is incredible work this little team is doing. And I really started to embrace that and reframe it for myself and my own ego.
Can I lens that in a way where I feel like you began to not define yourself by the way the world looked at you, but define yourself by the way you looked at the world?
Exactly. And people follow your lead,
That's
know?
Right.
And when I started getting excited about what we were building, that was the story. It was no longer what I had lost. It was more like, this is what I'm doing now with these other people that is really incredible. And it's not just about me. It's about this effort that we're collectively making. And it
for
really changed the trajectory.
Sorry. Yeah. And for the Sense and Signal people out there, I would like to say that we, maybe kind of like a lesson to be learned here. Or
our millions of audience members, right?
Yeah. The thought to be had. Right now, Dan and I have spoken. One of Dan's favorite authors, Simon Sinek. He can't stop talking about him.
Yes,
Simon Sinek.
Dan's cynical about Simon Sinek. We're trying to get him on the show though, but we no can do yet. But regardless,
saw the episode where I trashed him, and
you trashed him, yeah, so he doesn't want to join us. But he does make a comment about this notion of the janitor at NASA. And he doesn't say it cynically. His story is like the janitor at NASA can legitimately say, I send men to the moon. Right. Because his efforts are, if he didn't do his thing, then there would be no facilities for that place to do its thing. So that, yes, he is completely contributing to getting people up into space, and the reframing of ourselves oftentimes gets in the way, the framing ourselves gets in the way of ourselves. And I think identifying ego as the biggest problem is, I mean, I know you just sort of said it quickly. It's not, I don't think it's shallow at all. I think it's probably the thing that gets in the way the most of us making accurate decisions for the future. That's my opinion, but yeah.
Yeah, when I remember becoming a president and people just treated me so differently, even than being a VP. And so in a way, this transition, as painful as it was, in trying to figure out next steps and really dealing with ego and perception from others and all these things, it really has brought me back to a more empathy and just, I think, stronger, deeper relationships, because I've shifted some of that focus that naturally comes with those positions on status to much, much more relational, maybe deeper connections with my team and with colleagues. So that's interesting. I'm just grateful.
No, yeah. And I totally get that. And coming from higher ed, I could see it totally, especially how people treat you differently as you go up in rank, especially once you're up at the presidential level. The air is very thin up there. But I want to spend some time talking about the organization you're now leading. Yeah. And because I think it's a fiscal sponsorship organization. And a lot of people might not understand what a fiscal sponsorship organization does. And I think it's fascinating. I've worked with them here in Seattle. I've worked with Shunpike, which is one I can share some anecdotes from that. And I think that you're the one you're working for is very purpose driven. And I think that's also an interesting aspect to talk about too. So can you explain what is a purpose-driven fiscal sponsorship organization?
Yeah, and I've learned it too, because of course, having a background in higher ed, I didn't even know these organizations existed. So it is the organization that I work with is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, charitable. But one of the tenets, it has sort of three parts of its mission. One of them is to really develop other groups that want to go that route to becoming 501c3s. So we work with a number of organizations that are essentially groups of folks that come together. They have some sort of way they want to positively contribute to the community or the world. And it takes them time to get their ducks in a row, to make sure that this is really the path that they want to go, that it's sustainable. And so if they're approved, there is an approval process. It's not anyone. But if they're viable and they're approved by our organization, we essentially incubate them. We provide them with fiscal sponsorship, where we help them with their financials. We provide them with coaching. I'm a resource for them. That's that renaissance, wearing lots of different hats. Mm-hmm. We help them with their structure. We really incubate them until they are ready to get their own 501c3 status on their own. So it's really been it's about a third of what I do, but that's been a really fun thing to be a nonprofit, kind of helping other young to-be nonprofits succeed.
Yeah, when I used to do a lot of theater producing in Seattle, fringe theater producing, and I was connected with this organization called Shunpike, and they did the same thing. They basically took you under their wing. You used their 501c3 status for grants and fundraising. Yep. They'd process all the paychecks. If you had to pay people, you'd have your funds in their account, and they'd cut the checks for you and do all the accounting, all the back end business stuff. So like artists who are doing these. Yeah, it is great. It's a great service. So you as an artist can just focus on the work, and they just take a percentage of what profits you bring in to pay for the services they're providing you. So it is a really great service.
When you're saying nonprofit, where is the profit? Where is the money, the nonprofit money coming from? Is it coming from how is the cash flow? How do they get cash?
So the groups that we work with, what they do is they may apply for grants or other funding sources related to their missions. They use our 501c3 status, and then it funnels to them, but we take a percentage for the service fee of allowing them to use the status and giving them those incubation services like Dan noted. So
like it is,
it's a neat service because you get to know these individuals and you do a lot of kind of coaching, really, and talking with them. They use your platforms. You help them kind of get their ducks in a row. And these are folks that, in my experience at least, these are fantastic individuals that really just want to do something meaningful to the world and bring their talents to the community. And so you're helping them do that. And it's very fulfilling. It
does kind of break down the barriers of entry from an equity level.
Yes.
It does break down the barriers of entry into the nonprofit world.
Absolutely.
Which, without fiscal sponsorship organizations like the one you're leading, it could be very difficult for somebody to start up a grassroots organization.
You wouldn't know where to start. I wouldn't even know half the things that you are doing that you're providing. I wouldn't know they would even have to get done.
Well, just getting the 501c3 status,
is
very difficult.
That's a whole process too.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah, that's about a third of what we do. The other two parts at the nonprofit I lead are we have a co-working space with meeting space, and it's just really funky building with lots of different nonprofits and purpose-driven organizations that come together. They're usually small, so it's just efficient. It's very collaborative. It's kind of a cool space in downtown Lincoln where they can gather and really thrive through the relationships that they build and the community that we have there. So that's an element. And then we started an internship program with the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, which is right next door to us, where we partner with the Honors College, the Honors Program, and we place high-achieving students with small nonprofits to do community work. And that's been fantastic. Nice. Related to our brain drain efforts, we're trying to reduce the brain drain in Nebraska. So it's just been a combination of all these different pieces that have just really been meaningful for me.
One of the themes I'm hearing, the one I'm extracting right now from what I just heard is this as far as the spaces you're concerned, and it wells up a lot of ideas in me about issues I have about equity and the ability for people to have access to similar things. But what I bit onto was this cross-pollination aspect. You said you're creating this environment where these people can get together. And I'm assuming that there's DNA that's being transferred between these different groups. I wouldn't be surprised if perhaps sometimes that one person leaves from one group to another. If that hasn't happened, I'm sure it will happen one day in the future.
Yeah.
And you're reducing the friction of bureaucracy, essentially, right? Which late stage capitalism is becoming increasingly a thing. Right. You've got to sign this document and do this document, and you got to learn this thing before you do that one thing. And I feel like that's also a huge thing for transitions. When if we allow for that sort of free flow of information, the free flow of bringing these things together, getting rid of the cruft, that it allows for people to go through these transitions without the concern of being left kind of floating in the wind, basically. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, what I love about it, that cross-pollination you've talked about, is it's creative, but it's not turf-oriented, which I love. So, for instance, my staff, talk about cross-pollination. my team of 5, a couple of them work with other groups in our space. So they're part-time with me and they're part-time with another group. And so when you think about creative staffing and collaboration, sharing grant information, sharing resources, it's very non-turf oriented. And I think part of that is these are nonprofit folks, right? They have they're not perfect like any of us are, but they have their eye on the prize in terms of their mission of what they're trying to achieve. And it's not
and
as
I would say small grassroots nonprofit folks, because we could say the bigger nonprofits. You probably won't see that.
That's so true. No, these are small organizations. They usually have professional staff, but they're small. They may have 1 to 10 professional staff members.
Right.
And so there's a lot of it's not as tied to a scarcity mindset as sometimes you see with a lot of industries like nonprofits. These are folks that are intentionally sharing, and we have the space for them to do that. And maybe it's because they are young in terms of the age of their organization and small, that there's just more freedom, less hierarchy.
Right.
And so that we live on that cross-pollination, and it makes for a really thriving community.
Don't you want to have all that hierarchy? I don't understand.
Well, you know what? I miss the capacity.
More the better.
I miss the capacity. So, in my team, there's 5 of us, right? And so, when I was working at a college, God, I miss having an assistant.
Sure, sure.
I worked with people that were amazing. And just the capacity piece is certainly something I miss. But it is nice. The creativity part and the no turf or a reduction in turf has really been lovely.
So what do you think, you've taken us through this journey, from higher education to this transition period, now to this new successful venture that you're leading. What are the biggest takeaways you'd like to leave the audience with? What are the biggest lessons that Julie Murray-Jensen learned on this journey?
I just hope, thank you. That's a great question, Dan. I hope that my story, after many great years in higher ed, but really getting beat up at the end, I hope that my story of transition can be hopeful for folks, that if you decide you're leaving whatever field you're in, higher ed is one, whether that's by choice or by circumstance, that there is a pathway, that there is other work that you can find to be really fulfilling and valuable. And so I hope that it's just an example of hope. I hope people understand it is a process. It takes a long time. Try to embrace some of the pain that comes with it. It's so hard to do. But I feel like part of my letting go was just embracing some of the emptiness I felt with that change of identity, and really trying to take care of myself during that with self-care and a supportive network, but just knowing it's going to take time and it's part of the process, and that something will emerge. It's just bound to over time. So I would just leave folks, I hope, with a sense of hope that you can grow and continue forward in really positive ways, even though it's maybe a pathway you never imagined for yourself.
Growth mindset.
Yes, there you go.
And the other end of the spectrum, Julie, what is it that we said here today that you want people to forget we ever mentioned?
Oh, gosh, I don't know.
It's a joke. It's a joke. So, Julie, how can people get in touch with you if they want to reach out to you as a consultant?
Oh, sure. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way, and you can see my pathway there. I do have, a consulting website. It's Julie Murray-Jensen Workforce Solutions, and I do projects related to consulting and workforce development, but not as much anymore. But I still do some on the side, and I'm always willing to brainstorm with folks. So that's probably the best way.
Awesome. Well, Julie, it has been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And, I have so much respect and admire everything that you've been through. Admire you for everything that you've been through and getting to where you're at now, which, I could say when we were all in our doctoral program together, we knew, Julie was going to be the most successful out of our cohort.
Well, I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot, and just keep trying to get better. That's my goal.
Yep. That's right. Julie, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. Dan, thanks for introducing us and introducing to me one of my cousins. So, cuz.
There you go.
Yeah, we're going to do a genealogical chart and see how closely you guys are related later on. That'll be the next episode.
All right. Well, great job, guys. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yeah. All right, everybody.
Totally.
All right.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.